This is a voiceover video, a video I made the other day. I did this on YouTube Live, trying something new. The audio didn't work. I believe I figured out what I did wrong. So hopefully when I do the next video, it won't be so bad. So here's where I did the introduction, saying that I hope my first live YouTube video came out well. The video came out well, but with no audio, it doesn't really work well. A couple people did come on and try to view it, but I'm sure with no sound, it had to be frustrating. So I'm sure in the end, you guys probably just shut it off and hope for the best. So hopefully you'll tune back in for the next one. So anyways, in this intro here, I was explaining that the video is going to be disassembling this 3.1 liter V6 GM engine from my 2002 Pontiac Grand Prix. The other day when I left for work, it started up installed, and then it wouldn't start again. And apparently it was seized, or actually more likely stuck. And I'll explain more about that in a few minutes as I explain it in the video. So first thing I'm saying is I'm going to go ahead and pull the intake off. I know these camera angles might be a little off for you guys. The big one shows the engine on a not so great flattering angle, and then the one on my head is for the action view or what I'm actually doing. That one is probably the one you may want to be looking at most. I know it's small. If you full screen your video, it's not so bad. But I found that if I blow that up, because it's a preview on my laptop of the GoPro, the quality's not that great. So it gets pixelated when I blow it up even more. So I keep that one in the corner, and then I use the other video to kind of show what I'm doing. But with such a short tripod, you can't really see much. I am going to reposition the camera in a couple minutes, so you can get a better view. Not that it helps very much, but the head cam, the hat camera there seems to work pretty well to see most of what's going on. So I'm explaining I'm going to remove the intake manifold off first. So first thing I'm going to do is remove the ignition module and coil. That's done with those 4 bolts there, 2 10s in the front, 2 13s in the back. At least with this video, you're not going to hear the air ratchet going the whole time. Again, I apologize for the no audio. I do plan to do another video soon where I'm going to measure the engine, and I'm going to try to do that one live also. I explained in this video, the reason why I'm trying to do the live videos is because it's a quick production video. You do the video, you do it live, and then YouTube saves it for you as a video, which is what's allowing me to go ahead and do this voiceover by capturing the video, and now I'm just watching the video while I'm making this audio track, which I will then superimpose the two together and re-upload it as a new upload. So it's going to be the same video, just with commentary audio, which is better than silence. So I'm using the Sparkplug boot puller tool here. Allows you to get as close to the plug portion as possible, and you just kind of give it a quick twist like that and a pull, and it will usually pop off easy, as long as the plug boot isn't dried and crusted to the spark plug itself. Now, when I installed those about 80,000 miles ago, I did put some dielectric grease on them. They came off pretty easy, where it looks like I may even be able to reuse them, because I've still got some miles left on those wires. So we'll see as to what I do with those wires. I may reuse them. I may buy new ones. We'll see how the budget goes. So I'm cleaning off the bench to make room for parts. Probably something I should have done earlier. I go ahead and lower the pan down. That pan is something that I use when I rebuild transmissions in, because it allows me to contain all the transmission fluid. And now I'm going to continue to remove the parts to remove the upper intake manifold. Right now I'm explaining how I jump-started the car when the engine was stuck. And I used a tiny jump box that I have, one of those little portable ones I bought off of Amazon. Worked really well for jump-starting your car. It didn't help. But with those GM side mount terminals, you can't really get a good clip on them. So I did borrow the jump box from my job, and I tried that. And when I did it, the cable flexed like I was just showing earlier. And what that means is when the cable flexes, that you get a lot of current going from the battery in the jump box to the car. and the magnetism of the cable causes it to kind of look like it binds up almost, and it's the magnetic fields lining up, and that's a lot of current. Meaning, the starter was trying to turn, but it wasn't. So I then used a wrench, a couple wrenches, on the crank through the front of the engine, and I wasn't able to budge that motor. So I knew it was seized or stuck. I'm going to use the word stuck because it wasn't seized, and I didn't believe it was seized because of the noise that it made. What I'm doing now is I'm showing an example of the pry bar and how I was able to rotate the engine on the flywheel to remove the torque converter bolts, which made my life a lot easier. Because if I wasn't able to do that, I would have had to pull the engine and transmission out together and pull the engine off of the transmission with the torque converter still attached, which makes a giant mess. But I was able to force the engine over using the pry bar, and the explanation there was that I was using a 12-inch pry bar, and I had about an inch between the flat part and the transmission um, cutout, and I was able to get a good pry on that. And because it's a 12-inch uh, pry bar and 1 inch from the flywheel to the transmission case, I had about 11-to-1 advantage. So if I'm pulling on that sucker at 100 pounds, I'm giving 1,000 pounds of pressure to rotate it, and it was able to rotate it with some effort. I would say it took a good 100-pound pull to rotate the engine over to get those flywheel bolts off. But it was easier to do it that way than it was to pull the transmission in the engine and make that mess. Um, Right now, I'm talking about the socket sizes that I'm using, and that's a 7 millimeter. I'm readjusting the camera so you get a slightly better view. Again, slightly better view. I'm hoping to get a taller tripod at some point or something to give a more bird's eye view. Try to be conscious of where the camera is so I'm not standing in the way. Right now, I'm removing the map sensor. Those are two 7 millimeter bolts that hold that map sensor on there. I'm just using a 1/4 inch ratchet. It's just 2 bolts. It's just easier to do it that way. Unplug the connector. Always trying to pull connectors by the shell, not by the wires, because you don't want to break the wires. Here's the connector. Looking at the head cam, you can see the rubber vacuum line. It's dry and a little stuck. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my long needle nose 45 degrees pliers, and I'm going to go ahead and just pop that off like that. And then pop the line off with the fuel pressure regulator like that. And throwing that on the pile of parts inside the pan. Doing there with the laptop as I'm changing my view because the current view was the YouTube live view, so I could see what the public was seeing. But the problem there's a good 3, 4, maybe even 5 second delay between the YouTube live and what I'm actually doing. So I switched it to the laptop view to the program I use, OBS, which is a free program that allows you to stream videos that are on your laptop. So you just got to get the video to the laptop, and then it allows you to stream it to any media you want. And so what I did there was I just switched to the OBS view so I could get a half-second delay instead of that few second delay, which makes my life easier. Allows me to see what's going on better. What I'm doing now is I'm removing the 2 hoses that lead to the throttle body. These these send coolant to the throttle body to warm it up so that in the wintertime it doesn't get iced up. And what I'm doing now is I'm pulling the hoses off of the tube by pushing against the ends of the hose to kind of widen it to push it off versus pulling off down on the hose where it's clamped off, where you actually end up tightening the hose around it by kind of like a Chinese finger trap type deal. So if you push it off through the tip of the hose, the end of the hose, the flat part of the hose, and just push on it, after it breaks free, it should pop off pretty easy. What I'm doing now is I'm removing the crank sensor wire. That is the wire that goes from the crank sensor to the ignition module. also called the 7X signal on this vehicle. Um, and that's what gives the ignition pulse for those coils. Now I'm talking about how I'm going to go ahead and remove the EGR tube from that one little bolt there. It's easier to do that one little bolt than to try to break that nut down there on the lower left-hand side of your screen there for the tube. Well, that may come off easy because nothing on this motor would seem to be all that seized. Everything to come off quite easily. It's just, to me, easier not even play with something if you don't have to. Like, chances are I may not remove the exhaust manifolds from the head as I'm doing it myself. Now, as you can see, I'm standing in front of the camera. You can see what I'm doing there through the little head cam. I'm removing that one 10mm head bolt to loosen and remove that. And it's loose. I didn't pull it out. It's just loose. But it's free enough to remove it. And now I go ahead and start removing the upper plenum bolts. All the 10mm that are left. There's only 6 bolts holding the upper plenum on to the lower intake manifold. A couple of them are 13s that have threads on them so they hold components. And then the rest of them are just 10mm head bolts. They're all the same size bolts. Same size and length bolts. Excuse me. I'm putting all the bolts in the box. I'm not organizing the bolts. I pretty much know what bolt is for what, just from having worked on the engine so much. I'm talking about that front crank pulley right now. I did pre-loosen that crank pulley, meaning I put the puller on it and pulled it out a little bit to make sure it would move. I did that the day before I made this video when I put the engine on the stand and put it down in the basement. More things that I talk about. This is my basement where I'm doing all this work. I don't have a garage. Most of the time when I do things, it's outside on the ground, in the dirt, in the grass, or grass and dirt. The backyard kind of way. I could do it in my driveway. It's a gravel driveway, but all my tools and stuff are usually in the shed, so it's easier for me to just do it in front of the shed on the grass, right there. Right now I'm plugging the cam sensor. Trying to decide how I'm going to do this. I originally was thinking I wouldn't remove the fuel rail. I'm thinking that I could work around it, and you know, ever since the word, you can get into every bolt with the fuel rail still on there. I remove a couple bolts from the lower intake. That's one of the smaller intake bolts. There's 4 small ones and 4 long ones. That's one of the smaller ones, the easier one to get to. Then the other 2, the one on the other side of that, on the front of the motor, and then on the same side in the back of the motor, is kind of tucked under there, where you could use a swivel socket or a wrench to get it out. Right now I'm removing that coolant hose. That coolant hose was a little bloated for some reason, so I'm going to need to replace that too. I don't know why it's bloated, but it's bloated. Might just be old. Now I'm removing that coolant crossover tube there. That's the one that goes from the water pump to the heater core and has the lines that run to the front of the throttle body there, and also runs coolant into the top of the intake. Now I'm removing that other short bolt in the back of the engine on the other side. And now I'll start pulling the longer bolts. And you can see I can get in there on both sides. This is when I noticed that bolt, I believe. This is when I noticed that bolt that holds the fuel rail lines. Yeah, the fuel rail lines to the cylinder head bracket there. A small steel bracket on the cylinder head there that holds that those lines secure. So I decided to pop that. This is when I realized I don't have my universal um, with me in the toolbox. It's a brand new tool cart. I just transferred stuff from my old Mac cart that were in some of the previous videos. I just got that one from Harbor Freight for $150. I've been looking for a new tool cart for a while. I like the Matco cart, the size of the Matco cart, and the layout of the Matco cart. This is a hair different in that it has those two small drawers on the upper instead of the two big drawers. So that's almost an improvement because you actually have more space to store different things. So it works out well for that for me. But I couldn't see spending the money for a Macro cart when there's so many other things that I need to buy or want to buy. When I could get that one from Harbor Freight for $150. And the only downfall is that you have to assemble it yourself. But I mean, those are the things when you want a discount. When it's on sale for $150, you um, can't pass up that deal. It's a decent box. So I had decided that since I had to pull that one bolt off to remove the fuel rail, that there's only two more bolts holding the fuel rail on. So I went ahead and zipped those off and then just popped the fuel rail out. And now I'm talking about all the dirt and crap that I would vacuum or blow out of there before I remove the intake. Because, in an engine that you care about, you would clean it before you took it apart. Because I'm going to be going through this engine and redoing it, I'm not all that concerned about the dirt falling down in there because I didn't need to clean it out anyways. So it's not like the engine's going to be running to bring that stuff all around. Now I'm trying to do is seeing if I can get to that 10 millimeter bolt that's kind of dipped up under there, and I can't with the ratchet. And because my 3/8 swivel is currently on another project outside, rather than stop the video or break the video up to go get it, which would have taken about 5 minutes, I had decided to just use the ratchet, which would have taken the same 5 minutes, but at least I'm doing something. Um, so again, I had just swapped over the tools and straightened out the tools from my old cart to the new cart. I did find some of the tools on that project that I was missing, but I didn't see the universal, uh, which is what I would be using instead of using this ratcheting wrench. I did talk about the ratchet wrench. It's a gear wrench, ratchet wrench. I love those. They work great. I had talked about how ratchet wrenches have been around for quite a few years, but Gear Wrench came out with their brand, and what was nice about them is they've got a nice tight ratchet to them. In other words, they only click within a couple of just a little bit of movement versus the old ones, which you used to have to move at a good eighth turn before you got the next click. This one turns in like an eighth of a turn or 16th of a turn, depending on the size of the wrench. So it's a nice tight ratchet versus uh, a ratchet that doesn't move at all. That little bit of movement I have there on an older ratchet wrench wouldn't work. Um, I had an older set from Snap-on that I used to use that took a much wider swing to get it to actually ratchet. Now this one right here is going to come off a little quicker because I've got almost a full quarter turn. I talked about how I have more room on that back one. When I tighten and torque it, I'll use a different tool. But for taking it off, it doesn't matter what you use. That's why I'm using the ear ratchet and the ear. I'm going to be switching to the ear gun when I get the bigger bolts. The impact It doesn't matter what you use to take parts off, because removing stuff, you just want to do it as quickly as possible. But when it comes to putting them on, you could certainly bring them in with the ear ratchet or the ear gun, but you definitely want to do your final torquing with a torque wrench for critical bolts. All right, so now you're going to see me do something kind of silly, and I'm going to try to remove the intake. And the reason why I say that's silly, for those of you who are familiar with this motor, that valve cover goes across the intake, so it's not going to come off with those valve covers still on. So it takes me a good few seconds there. Now I realize it. It takes me a few seconds there to realize that, hey, you have to take the valve covers off to remove the intake, moron. Just one of those things that, again, I'm not using a manual. I'm just disassembling the motor. It's just, removing parts, you're removing bolts, not using a manual, just kind of winging it from memory. It's been a while since I've done one of these motors. Used to do these all the time, but, these motors, they're kind of phasing out a little bit. They've upgraded them to the 3.1 and 3.4 were the same motors, and then they came out with the 3.5 and the 3.6, I believe they are. I've seen them in the Pontiac G6 and the Malibus and stuff. It's a different motor. It's a totally different motor. Well, it almost looks like the same platform. It's really a completely designed different motor. So now I'm removing the valve cover from the front cylinder head. This is the one that you would see if you were looking into the engine bay. This one's the easy one to get to. It comes out even with the motor mount still on it. You can just kind of sneak it out. That was one of the improvements they had made in this motor, is that they allow you to remove the valve cover with the motor mount still on it. Some of the older ones, you used to have to take that motor mount out, which was a bit of a pain in the butt when it came to working on it in the car, because that motor mount reaches underneath and it's clamped in by the AC compressor, so you used to have to remove the AC compressor to get it out. So that's a slight improvement there, is that you're able to get it off. Now this one here, to get it off, you could work around, and again, I'm in the way. You can work around that stud. I realized I was in the way in a few minutes. So what I'm looking for now is I'm looking for a socket to grab the hex that's on the end of the stud there. It's more of an inverted Torx, I believe, or inverted star socket, I believe, which I didn't bring out with me. And I can't find a socket to make it work. So what I end up doing is I end up showing you a little trick for removing studs if you don't have any special tools to do it. First I tried to use vice grips, but that doesn't work either. I tried just grabbing the tip and just trying to grab it and turn it, but it's kind of tight back there. The stud itself is kind of tight. So I'm going to show you how to do it if you don't have any special tools, and if the vice grip isn't enough to grab it. You don't want to just grab the threads and turn it. You could try grabbing the lower shank and turning it. I'm just trying to grab the tip to get it enough to break free, and that's not really working out for me. So what I decided to do is show you guys a trick that you can do. Is I'm grabbing the two nuts that held the ignition module coil pack assembly bracket on, and I'm going to use a wrench, and you put the two nuts on the threads, and then you tighten them up to each other, and then you use the lower nut to remove the stud. So I have the two nuts on there. There's two nuts on there, back to back, flange to flange, I should say. And now I'm going to use a wrench and a socket to tighten it. Now I'm tightening it, and that's not enough. What's happening is both nuts are turning, but the stud is not. So I tighten it a little more. Try it again, and it still didn't work. I tighten it one more time. And then that time I believe it worked. Yeah, it did. And then I remove the stud. So that's a little trick for removing studs, is just go ahead and back the two nuts up together, tighten them up, you got to get them pretty tight, and then you go ahead and use the lower nut to break it free, which is going to work fine. And I'll use the same method if and when I put that stud back. When I put the stud back, I'll tighten it with that the top nut, and then I'll use the wrench in the socket to remove that, and then I'll go ahead and proceed and put the bracket back on that way. Just easier. The nuts are already on. There's no sense in breaking them free prior to that. And when I say if I put it back together, it's going to depend on what it costs to actually fix this motor. Now, as we go through it, I'll explain what's wrong with it and what I find, because I don't want to let the secret out too early. But this is an older car. It's a 2002. It's got some rust on it. It needs more than just the engine because, believe it or not, the strut mount broke on it recently too. Apparently, because I noticed when I opened up the hood the other day that the strut was pushing up through, meaning it needs a strut assembly, which it's needed that probably anyways because of the mileage. It's got 170,000 miles on it. It's an older car, so I'm only going to spend so much money if I decide to fix it, and I'm hoping to get another year out of it if I do that. Um, but it's going to depend on how much this motor is going to cost to fix. I've already looked at some preliminary prices about what things are going to cost me, and if the damage in this engine is not horrible, then I'll go ahead and repair it and go through it and rebuild it. But if it's going to cost me an arm and a leg, then there's no point. So what I'm doing now is I'm using one of my swivel sockets to get in there to remove a bracket. That bracket is holding the other coolant line that goes to the heater core that comes out of the thermostat housing. It's being stubborn. I've got it loose. I've got the nut off, I believe. It may still be on. It's a slotted bracket, so it doesn't have to be off. It could just be loose. And then I'm trying to remove it. So what I decided to do is I try to get innovative. I look for something to pop it off with. I look so confused right there. I get another another college try with my hands. Realize that's not going to work. So what I do is I grab a hammer and a pry bar, and I'm going in against the flange, and I'm giving it a tap, and you can see it just pops right out. And that's just what happens when an O-ring gets stuck. It's going to stick to it. They like to glue themselves, so I just kind of pried it off and popped it that way. And now the lower intake is off, and now I can see inside of the engine. I made a few comments as I was going through about how clean this engine is. 170,000 miles. You can see it looks very clean. I've never been in this engine myself. I do know that when we had gotten it back in 2004 is when we bought it, we had gotten an extended warranty on it. Because while you're paying for a car, I like to not have to pay for things if anything major breaks. And we did have them replace the lifters. Because it's a problem with these cars. They just make noise. They're not bad. They just bleed down, and when they're cold, they kind of make a rattling noise. And these lifters are doing it again. They've been doing it for a while. So we had to replace the lifters when it was still under warranty, because it's under warranty at the time. So I didn't do it myself. I had another dealership do it, and they did it under warranty. Now what I'm doing is I'm removing the rocker arms, trying to keep them in order so that if I reassemble this motor, they go back in their same spots, the rocker arms and the push rods. And the reason why you do that is so that where parts wear, they wear when they're new to a certain way, and then if you put them somewhere else, they have to wear another way, which causes them to wear out even more. So if you can put them back where they came from just by keeping them in order, then it makes life easier when it comes to the parts. So I'm breaking all of the rocker arms free, and I'm putting them in the pan in order by front to rear, and they will stay there until I clean them and put them back in the motor at the time if we put this motor back together. Again, it's still not 100% sure what I'm doing in the motor. I know what's wrong with it now because this video has obviously been done. This was done live, so I already know what's wrong. But depending on what it's going to cost to repair will depend on whether or not I fix it or not. The cost for the entire repair, including 2 new front struts, I'm hoping to be under $1,000. If I can do it for under $1,000, I'll do it. If not, I'll just have to register one of the other cars that I have that I bought as a fix and flip type deal, and I'll just have to register it and drive that around for a while until I decide, what I really want to drive. Um, again, I did like the way this live stream worked out, with the exception of the audio. I think the video quality is not bad. I do need to figure out what I'm going to do with that main camera. Right now, the angle's not so bad because we're working on that side, but moving it around, it's not an easy thing to do because the reason why I don't have any audio in this one is because I had to switch cameras at the last minute before I started the video. The other camera I was going to use allowed me to use the audio directly from that camera. So the little wireless mic that I had plugged into that, and it allowed me to send it down to the HDMI cable that used the video capture device that I'm using and use the audio from that. But this new camera, for some reason, doesn't work like that. So I had to scramble to get the audio to work, and in my scrambling, I ended up with no audio for the video. So while the video is not bad, the video quality itself is not bad. The audio, there was no audio, and that's why we're doing this voiceover. So this is the last rocker arm. Okay. So now that I've removed the rocker arms, I'm removing the intake gasket now, because the intake gasket is trapped by the push rods. The push rods themselves go around it. You can't sneak a gasket in and out of there, those plastic gaskets, because the push rods go over them. So you have to remove the push rods when you do an intake manifold to get the whole thing done. I am removing the lifter bracket. This is what holds the roller lifters in line so that the rollers stay lined up with the camshaft. I'm moving this now because I want to take a look at them to make sure there's nothing broken or flat or anything that's going to cause any other damage to the motor. As I'm disassembling, I am inspecting all of the parts to see exactly what is going on as I'm taking it apart. So far, I haven't found anything that can't be reused as far as hard parts go, except of course those lifters, which should be replaced now, just because they make that clicking noise. Now, I could reuse them if I want, knowing that it's not going to permanently fix it anyways. But I mean, so I didn't keep the lifters in order, knowing that if I redo this motor, I'm going to replace them. They are kind of sort of in order, it looks like. Yeah, it looks like I'm out of order now. I'm not going to reuse these lifters. I already figured out the lifters aren't that much money. They're only about $6 a piece, I believe it was, $6 or $7 a piece. Comes to like $60 or $70 for a whole set, so maybe not even $6 a piece. They're not that expensive. So I'm removing them, and everything's coming apart easy because there's no sludge, there's no shellac, there's no buildup of dirty oil stuck to parts like they usually are. Everything looks very clean. 170,000 miles. Everything's very clean, which is kind of surprising. Now, I had always used the maintenance monitor for the oil changes, which means I was changing my oil probably every 5,000 to 6,000 miles. And the only reason why I kept doing that was because every time I added oil and I looked down that engine, I saw that it was clean. So I knew the oil wasn't hanging around too much, because if it was, then it would be all dirty and shellacky. So there's that. So here I find some gunk in the cooling system. It's kind of like a slimy goo. I have no idea what it is. It may be a depression. It may just be some crap of using the Dexco stuff. That organic coolant just kind of makes crap when it gets old. And I had done the video where I had flushed the system out. Probably about 2 years ago, I believe it was, when I made that video. I don't even remember. I believe it was like 2 years ago. Um, and it had never been changed before that, so that might be where all that's coming from. Is that I should have never let it go that long with the original coolant in it. At least I don't remember ever changing it. It's one of those things we don't think about, but it's definitely something that should be done. Uh, if I put this engine back together, I may go to just regular green coolant for this one, since it'll all be new stuff and new parts. I'll flow some stuff through the radiator to clean it out completely. I'll flow some stuff through the heater core to clean it out completely, and then I'll switch to the regular, you know, inorganic antifreeze, regular stuff, because it doesn't seem to dry out like that one does. So I'm removing the spark plugs now, and I'm talking about why I'm removing the spark plugs. When when you have an engine, you want to see what kind of condition it's in. When it spins freely, before you remove it, unless you can bolt the starter to the block like this one, you can. Um, you want to do a compression test, just to see how the engine is, just to get an idea of what's going on with the engine on the as far as how well the cylinders seal. But because this engine is stuck or seized, you can't really do that. So what I'm talking about here is that now is the time after I release the valve train and remove all the pieces from the valve train, all the valves are closed. Now's the time to go ahead and do what's called a leak down test. The leak down test is a static test that allows you to pump air into the cylinders and see how much of it escapes statically. The compression test is a dynamic test where you're cranking the engine. Actions are actually happening. You're actually causing air to get drawn in the cylinder and pumping it up, and you're looking to see how much compression the engine can build. So this is a leak down tester here that I'm going to go ahead and hook up and show how it's used. And let's see how this came out on camera. Be interested to see. So this part screws into the spark plug hole. The over amounts of spinning that I'm doing is because I'm not used to this particular one. Even though it's my own, I just don't use it that often. I'm hooking up the air pressure regulator, hooking up the air to the air pressure regulator. Now I'm rotating it, and I'm looking for the gauge to read set to zero number. I like to get as close to zero as possible. Um, it's going way above and way below. I'm looking for zero. I've got my hand away because it's slowly creeping up. It was too much, so I back it off way too much. Then I bring it back in until it says zero again. And I kept going over and under the gauge until eventually I got it. And now I hook it up to the cylinder, and I find out that I was way under because the gauge went down to zero. I'm looking and listening for a leak, and there isn't any because actually the regulator is set too low. I realized that once I unplug it, it didn't come back up. I realized what my mistake was, is that I had lowered the gauge too much. I lowered the regulator too much, which then when I hooked it up, it went down to zero. So then I went ahead and cranked it again, set it to zero, and I plugged it in. And I plug it back in again. And now I'm looking at it, and it was good. That cylinder was good. That one, I believe, was 80% leak. And now I'm listening to see where the air is coming from, because it's going to come from someplace. And I'm talking about how I can see and smell it. You just saw me stick my face in there, and I can smell it. Now I'm listening at the intake side and the exhaust side, and I didn't hear nothing on that cylinder. So cylinder one was good. That one is cylinder one. I talked about the cylinder layout and how the cylinders on this side of that big camera are all cylinders, the oddball cylinders, cylinders 1, 3, and 5. And now I go ahead and check cylinder 3. that cylinder was a little better. The gauge was actually a little higher. Same thing. It's all coming out of um, the valley or past the rings. Now I'm doing cylinder 5. And now when I hook up to cylinder 5, I see that it's low. The cylinder was actually low. And I hear it coming from the crank. So I checked the gauge because I didn't believe it. I was surprised because the engine ran well. But I had a leak past the rings on that cylinder. Now I'm going over to cylinder 2. Cylinder 2 is fine. Now I'm going to cylinder 3. Cylinder 3 had a leak. Cylinder 3 had a leak at the intake. So the intake valve isn't seating. It could have a piece of carbon up underneath it. No idea until I take the valve off what's going on. What I'm doing there is I'm showing how when I'm pushing down on it, I'm going to bring the gauge up in a second. When I'm pushing down on the gauge actually goes up a little bit, almost goes to normal, which just tells you the problem with that one cylinder is just that intake valve. So I have one that's going past the rings on cylinder 5, and I have one that's going past the intake valve on cylinder 3. So again, these are all things that I'm going to have to look at as I disassemble the engine further to see what's going on. So the cylinder heads are going to be a completely separate project or a completely separate video where I'm going to go through the cylinder head to see exactly what's going on, what will need to be done with that one. This one was fine. It didn't change because it wasn't leaking. I just being thrown off. I'm hearing it from the crankcase. I'm feeling it from the exhaust side. Feeling for ear again. And that cylinder was actually fine. So I am going to have to go through the cylinder heads, which, obviously 170,000 miles, I'd be silly not to. So again, that's going to have to go on to, costs and stuff. I'm going to have to look to see if that cylinder 3 valve can be cleaned or replaced, how they look. Are they going to need to be resurfaced? Can they be resurfaced? Well, I need to get new valves. What do the seats look like? Can they be cleaned? Could that cylinder that's leaking have a cracked seat? Whole other issue. Speaking of cracks. So my next thing here, I believe, was to continue to remove the cylinder heads now. So what I'm going after now is that little tiny heat shield that goes across the crossover pipe for the exhaust. So I go ahead and zap those bolts out, and I was surprised that they came out as easy as they did. I grabbed the impact because this is how I'll deal with bolts on the exhaust that the bolts are rusty but clean. In other words, not so weak that I know they're going to break. Is I'll just grip it and rip it. I'll take my impact and just nail it and see what happens. Worst case scenario, is a bolt breaks. A little harder is when it kind of strips the head of the bolt, because then you have to find something to grab it with to get it. If the bolt breaks, then you just have to extract it, either drill it out and retap it, or extracted somehow. Now those two bolts in the back there, you could see it earlier before I repositioned the camera the second time. Um, those two bolts on the back there that go to the downpipe, the exhaust to the cat, those bolts broke when I took them out, which was fine because I had a feeling they weren't going to be too easily coming out. Those were nuts, um, and they didn't come out very easy. Now these nuts all came out surprisingly well. I expected those bolts to break. So now I'm trying to remove the pipe. It's a little stiff. They kind of rust themselves or glue themselves to the exhaust manifold. Give it a little tap, and then boom, it comes right off. Um, and now my cylinder heads are free from the exhaust manifolds on either side. So next thing I'm gonna do is remove that motor mount. There's 3 bolts that hold that, but 2 of them go through the AC compressor. I left the AC compressor in the car because I didn't want to discharge it. Then I have to refill it. So I left the AC compressor and the power steering pump in the car, which when you do an engine like this, that's what you do. If you can, you just kind of like leave it. And that one there, it actually lays nicely on the subframe. And same thing with the power steering pump. It got a nice little spot. It kind of like hangs itself onto the firewall with. All right, so now I'm removing head bolts. So I guess I'm removing that rear cylinder head, the left head if you're looking at it from where I'm standing now. I'm doing a reverse tightening sequence. Not exactly reverse, but going from the outside in. That's a recommended way of removing the head bolts. Kind of evenly remove it. I don't know if you saw that. The head kind of like just removed itself almost. It kind of was so loosely attached there that it just kind of like rolled off, which is fine. It means the gasket's never baked on from overheating or getting too hot. If you look, the gasket came off actually really clean. I'm inspecting the gasket right now, looking for anything like coolant crossover leaks, compression leaks, um, oil leaks, and I'm not seeing nothing. I'm looking in the cylinders to see if I can see anything. I'm looking at the condition of the cylinders. I'm looking for a ridge ream, where the top of the cylinder wears out more than the rest of the cylinder, and you end up with a ridge there that when you go to remove the piston, the ring will catch it and then collapse. The ring lands on you as you remove the pistons. If you have that experience, you have to cut it off. But again, there's no ridge ream at all. There's just a slight little ring of carbon there. Nothing horrible. Nothing that'll stop the piston from coming out. Talking about that, taking a peek in there. I do a better inspection of the cylinders later once I get the rest off. So now I'm looking at taking that bracket off. I'm pointing to the 2 bolts I already removed that went through the AC compressor. Hold on bolts. It's just a single 15. Grab it, rip it, pop it, throw it in the bucket, give it a tap, remove that motor mount. And put it in the tin. Kind of making room for the other cylinder head. Okay. Next thing I need to remove is the oil dipstick tube there, as you can see, kind of hanging up there. I guess I didn't do that yet. I'm gonna have to at some point. I probably see it soon. Doing the same thing, removing the cylinder head, going from the outer edges first, then work on the middle bolts. This is probably when I see the dipstick. Yeah. That's when I see the dipstick still in the way. Removing that 10mm bolt. 10mm head bolt that's holding the dipstick on, kind of giving it a wiggle and a shake. Sometimes these things can be difficult. Again, for a high mileage motor, things are coming off and apart pretty well. Putting the bolt back in the hole, I'll do that sometimes. If the bolt's not in the way, I'll stick it back in the hole. some reason I was trying to use a 10 millimeter to remove a 15 millimeter head. Could have been 13. Probably was 13. The reason why I'm saying that is because where I put it in the box. And then that cylinder head popped itself off too. So again, these cylinder heads are coming off with no problems. The gaskets aren't baked on. I won't have to do a whole lot of head cleaning, a cylinder head or block cleaning. If you look, it's very clean. Just probably scrape it quickly with a razor blade just to clean it up. But I don't see the gasket where it kind of stuck itself to it. Now I remove it. Now I'm taking a peek at that valve, and I'm not seeing anything. But I'll do a better inspection when I disassemble the cylinder head. I pick it up and set it over there. Again, I'm looking at the cylinders the same. Alright, so now before I flip the motor off, I want to remove that front cover. To do that, I need to remove the crank pulley. Remove the tensioner first, get it out of the way. Grab my bolt grip puller there. I do talk about how I used that yesterday, or the day before this, I should say, 2 days ago from now. About how I used that the day before. I did this video to loosen the crank pulley so I know that it moved, and the reason why I did that, talk about that now, is because that bolt grip puller I used on my truck on the same thing ended up breaking and cracking right in half. So I wanted to make sure it worked. What you don't see is underneath the cabinet there is I also have my Mac steering wheel puller under there too, which has a similar bracket to attach to a steering wheel, and I grabbed that in case that one breaks. I had bought that, used it one time on my truck. It broke. This was years ago. It broke. Having the lifetime warranty, I bought it back, got a new one, and this is the first time I've used this kit. Was on this engine, and it worked fine for this engine. It didn't bind up at all. If I remember correctly, on the truck it wasn't binding up either. It just maybe it was just a bad casting for that particular one. But when it happens, you kind of gotta wonder. But again, I have that steering wheel puller, which has a much more robust center puller bracket piece. I've always used that for removing cranks. It's just finding the bolts. And that's what's nice about the bolt grip kit is that it has all those different bolts that will help you for most engines. This particular crank pulley has 3/8 bolts, believe it or not, even though everything on the everything on the engine is metric as far as bolt heads go. That particular uh, harmonic balancer has 3/8 bolts. Now, why? I don't know. Maybe it's from an old design that they had used that used 3/8 bolts and they never updated it. Who knows? But it used 3/8 coarse thread bolts to remove it, which is quite interesting because I was looking for bolts to pull it. I couldn't find any. That's when I was glad I found that old old new bolt grip puller set that had the bolts in it. So now you can see I've got the crank pulley off. I'm talking about how I was worried about pulling it because there is a bead of silicone on the end of the crank there to help the oil, keep the oil from weeping through um, between the crank and that pulley. So I talked about how I was concerned about how that could have made it harder to remove it because it would have glued it to it. Um, but it came off pretty easy. It worked. That tool worked well. Again, it was a Harbor Freight tool I bought years ago. Um, you know, I will buy some tools from Harbor Freight depending on what it is. Sometimes it'll just be to try. I believe that kit when I bought it was only $12 when I got it. So I mean $12, maybe it's worth the risk. This is when I didn't have all my tools at home. So these were tools that I used at home where I had my professional stuff at work. So I had no problem buying a Harbor Freight kit here and there, just knowing that I had my professional tools at work to back me up. That if the tool I'm using at home didn't work, with my current job, my professional tools are at home also. So I have my home tools, which is what that was from, and my professional tools, which is what the Mac steering wheel puller is from. And between the two, I should be able to get the job done with what I have. I don't have every tool out there, but I still want to buy more. Um, and I will probably have to buy some if I redo this engine because there's some tools I don't have. I'm talking about the motor mount now, I believe, for a few seconds there about how I knew it was bad, and boy, is it really bad. So I'm going to need a new motor mount if I do this. I'm looking at the um, front cover bolts there, the timing chain cover bolts there. There's a couple of 13 millimeter head bolts, and then there's some 10 millimeter head bolts, and that's what I'm looking at. So I moved three 13 millimeter bolts, and then there was another one there. I thought that socket might fit on, but it didn't. So now I'm putting the 10 on there, and I'm doing the rest, except for the one that I find I think right there that's not 10. Um, so then I zip off the 10s. Talking about how the crank sensor is right there. The crank sensor works with the harmonic balancer. GM calls that the 24X sensor, and that is for misfire detection only. It is actually not used for ignition or fuel. It is only used to detect misfires. Looking for the right socket for that bolt, which I believe was 13, if I remember correctly. I don't know why I had such a hard time finding the right bolt socket for that bolt, but um, I insisted that it wasn't the same 13 I used for the rest for some reason. So yeah, there's the two 13s, and then there's the front cover. The timing chain does have a little slack in it, but not a whole hell of a lot. It does have slack, but it's not that bad. It's not as bad as a 170,000 mile motor. Um, you would think it'd be for 170,000 miles. Obviously, if I do this, I will replace the timing chain. It has steel gears, so I don't need to replace the gears. I could get a timing set, um, but I don't need a timing set for about half the price. I can get just the timing chain itself. So I'm going to go ahead and if I do this motor, do that. I'm hoping and looking for the right size socket there, and I get lucky, and it is a 24 millimeter socket, which is good because if it wasn't, I don't know what I would have done. Um, because those are the only tools that I have down there in my basement. Just the ones that I dragged down there to do this motor. Normally, my tools aren't in the basement like this. Normally, my tools are out in my tool shed. Um, Closest thing to a garage I have is a 12-foot by 12-foot shed, but you can't fit a car in there. It's raised on a platform, so you can't drive a car up there either. So everything I do, I have to do outside. So now what I'm doing is I'm removing the little timing um, guide, uh, timing chain guide that's on there. There's two 11 millimeter bolts. That's why I had to grab the oddball sized. Um, Taking a peek at it, see what it is, and it's got some wear in it. It needs a new one. It's got it's got 170,000 miles on it, so you have to expect it to have a rub mark in it here and there because 170,000 miles is 170,000 miles. There, I just slid off the timing chain crank uh, gear. Just gonna put that aside now so it doesn't get dropped or lost. Um, Now I'm looking at it. Now what I'm doing is I'm looking to remove the camshaft itself, and there are two Torx bits there that need to be removed. And it's the largest small one I've got, meaning it's the largest one that uses the 1/4 inch ratchet. They come pretty easy. And what that bracket does is between that and the timing gear, it gives the camshaft its how much forward and back it gets, how much thrust movement it has. Putting the cam sprocket bolt back on, try to remove it. It's not coming, which is kind of odd that it's not coming. Um, it's probably because the rear cam journal is hitting the oil pump drive that's still on there, which I'm about to remove right there. So there I remove the sprocket, the nut for the hold down. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and crimp just the edge of it with the vice grips just to give me some leverage to lift it out. Trying to get the screwdriver underneath there to help pry it. There we go. It popped off. And that's the oil pump drive. What it does is the camshaft meshes with that. I'm talking about theirs. I'm surprised there was no gasket on there because usually when they do it at the dealer, they'll replace that O-ring and put a gasket underneath there to help prevent oil leaks. But maybe because it was under warranty, the technician that did it decided that he didn't need to do that because it wasn't leaking. So I don't know, something I would have replaced just while I'm in there, because you get a lot of oil leaks in from the valley there. Now you can see the camshaft that's coming out, and yeah, see the journal on the back there by the gear. That's why it wouldn't come out. You have to have that out in order for that to be removed. I'm looking at the camshaft, and it's not bad. It's not worn. I don't see any rolled over noses. And it's a roller cam, so I mean, as long as you take care of it, it should work fine. So now's the time to go ahead and pull the pin, turn the engine over. Moving the drain bucket over in case there's still any residual coolant in there. I did drain the coolant as best I could by removing the two bolts that are the block drains. You can see one right there in the big camera, right underneath that R30 number, just off to the right a hair, lower to the right. That's a what they call a block drain. And what that allows you to do is drain as much coolant as possible out of the engine itself um, through that lower jacket. Of course, you can't get everything. So as you can see, there's some coolant coming out. But, I got most of it. No coolant came out of the other side of the cylinder head, so, I mean, it must not be that bad. It must have worked out one side, but not the other. Sometimes you get sediment down there, depending on, how good the coolant was and stuff. I don't remember ever overheating this motor. And by the way the head gasket came off, I'm not surprised. What happened there was the oil pump drive rod fell out. Now I'm showing you that bad motor mount. As you can see, it's bad. I kind of knew it was bad. I could feel it banging. I thought it was those dog bone mounts. By the way, it was banging. I never physically checked it, but obviously that motor mount's no good. So I'm gonna have to replace that mount. Kind of setting those bolts back in their holes. Just again, sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. So now I'm talking about those three bolts along the oil pan there. There's three on the other side too, and what those do is they actually hold onto the main caps to kind of make the lower oil pan kind of almost structural. One thing I found in the research of this motor is that when I was looking around at all the different parts that are available, I wasn't able to find a crank kit too many places, or they were sold out on some places. I did find one on eBay for about $150. Um, and originally I thought maybe it's because the engine's old, but now maybe I'm thinking it's because the engine's so damn reliable. Um, I've never had too many problems with these engines in my life. Even in a dealer, I had one that had a broken camshaft, which, from what I understand, can happen if the intake starts to leak coolant into the oil. It can cause the cam to grab and seize and then snap, something that's not supposed to happen. I had come across some examples of a broken piston that grabbed the cylinder and seized or stuck the motor. But that didn't happen in this engine. We already have the heads off, so we can already see the pistons aren't cracked. So we know it's not that. The camshaft came out, so we know it wasn't that. But I mean, it was a hard stuck. In other words, it wouldn't turn a little bit when you move the wrench, which told me it was something on the crankshaft. And we're only a few minutes away from him, or we'll be able to see what it was. It definitely was on the crankshaft, and I kind of had a feeling it was on the crankshaft. My first thoughts, because of the no noise thing, and maybe it was more hopeful thinking than first thoughts, was that the timing chain maybe broke and got wound up underneath and jammed itself and wedged itself where I couldn't turn the engine over either way, and that's why it was stuck. That was maybe wishful thinking, but maybe I shouldn't have been wishing that, because I probably would have had some broken hard parts, like that chain cover. All right, so here's the oil pan, and again, it doesn't look that bad. It's not caked in oil, not caked in oil, sludge. It's not, it's got a little varnish on it. You can see that that windage tray has a little varnish on it, but it's not like built up or caked up. The oil pump is clean. I don't see any debris on the oil pump screen. Again, the engine is very clean. Some more crack that kills. Okay, so now I'm removing the oil pump, one bolt. I'm looking in there for any debris. Didn't see any. Something kind of fell out, which there may be something that connects the oil pump drive rod to the drive. I'm not sure. That's a bolt up from the oil pan I dropped down there. I thought I just threw in the bucket there. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the windage tray. I'm looking for the bolt size. The nut size, I should say. Those are nuts. Now, I did take this apart a little out of sequence, and that usually, and at least for assembly, you have to do this. The timing components have to be in, the timing cover has to be on, then the oil pan goes on. I removed it differently because it doesn't matter how you remove it. But that's the sequence for assembly. Is the timing cover has to be on it, then the oil pan goes on it. Moving the 5 nuts that hold the windage tray on. The idea behind the windage tray is to keep the oil from sloshing up under the crank when you're taking turns or corners. It just kind of prevents the oil from going up against the parts that are throwing around in the engine to keep it from slopping the oil around. Okay, so now I'm looking at my rods and I'm checking to see if any of them are loose. If you have a rod knock, this is usually how you find out which one's knocking, by shaking them. This is when I put the crank bolt back on. Now I take an 18mm wrench. What I'm doing now is I'm looking for my number stamps, which I thought were in those drawers, but they're not. They're in my toolbox out in the shed. So what I ended up doing is I ended up just lightly scribing the numbers on the rods instead, because now's a good time to stamp your mains and your rods. And if I was smart enough to bring those stamps with me, I would have done that, but I didn't do that. So that just goes to show you how I didn't think ahead of everything. So what I ended up doing is you'll see me kind of scribe numbers on each one, and then you'll see when I take them off, I leave them in line, and that's because I want to put everything back the way it came. So here I have a scribe or a pick, and I'm just kind of scribing on the polished backside where they ground it to balance the rod. They grind that area there, so it's pretty clean. And so this, anytime you scratch it, it will probably show up. I don't know if it will, but what I'll do is I'll keep the rods in line until I can get some real decent stamps on them. If I end up reusing them. Now what I'm doing is I'm looking for the appropriate 12-point socket for the rods. What I want to do is I want to remove the rods first, remove the pistons first. I suspect it's not a piston bearing that's grabbing. I suspect it's a main bearing that's grabbing. Because if it was a rod bearing, it would probably move a little bit back and forth, as the swing of the rod, at least a little bit. This engine doesn't budge when you try to move it with the wrench. Here's where I get the wrench out for the 18. Now it's tight. And it's not turning at all, so I give it a little tap. And there's the rod cap. Trying to get the bearing out of there. Take a look at the bearing, and I'm in shock that the bearing looks like it's almost brand new. There's a motor with 170,000 miles, especially one that's stuck or seized. It's a little on the shocking side that the bearings look like they were almost brand new. Almost like this whole procedure is shameful as to why you're even taking the engine apart. I'm putting the rod cap on the right way. Those two notches have to line up with each other. There's two notches on the bearings that keep them from rotating or spinning. And you line those up so that they're up against each other on the same side. And now I'm checking to see if the engine's still seized. Or like I keep saying, stuck, not seized. My idea of a seized engine is when it welds itself together, or if a rod breaks and impales itself into the side of the block or through the block, and then it won't rotate again because it's actually physically locked up. This engine here is able to force to turn over. Probably what I'm talking about now too. I was able to force it to turn over. So it's not exactly seized. It is just stuck. It's just the question is what's causing it to be stuck and how much damage did it do. And that's what we're going to find out really pretty soon. Talking about how I'd like to take the rods out and then take off the mains one at a time and see which main causes the engine to actually rotate or turn. Popping another cap off. And then this is where I find that the crank is hitting, not the crank, the end of the rod is hitting and it's kind of wedged between the crank journal and the side of the block, which means I cannot get it to go down anymore. So I'm trying to turn the engine over. And this is when I realized I'm not going to be able to do what I wanted to do, which was remove the pistons and then loosen the crank. So now I'm going to go ahead and start loosening the crank bolts, the main bolts, and see which one's locking the engine up. I'm procrastinating over it. It's what it is. That's why it's taking so long. Grabbing the 15 socket. Zipping it out. Zipping it out. Giving it a tap. Giving it a tap. Checking to see if it loosened it up. And it didn't. So now I'm removing the second one, number 2 main. This is when I decide to remove this cap. Try it again. Remove this cap. And boom, the engine turned. So what's going on is underneath that cap. So I remove that main cap. I take a peek in there. And I find aluminum chip got in there and wedged itself and was gouging out the bearing. So it's a piece of aluminum. So I'm dragging my fingernail over it, and I'm looking to see if I can feel anything, and my fingernail's not grabbing that line. So that little line there is not even grabbing my fingernail, which when it does that, it means it's hardly even there. You can see it, but you can't feel it. And I'm seeing a chip of aluminum in there. The engine's actually rotating pretty easy now. Now I can go ahead and take that number 2 piston out. Again, bearing looks damn good. I'm looking at the phenolic coating on the side of the piston there. That takes up the space between the piston and the cylinder bore to help prevent piston slap. And it's just a very fine coating. If you look, it's very fine. It's another one of those where it kind of fades away on the side. It's very thin coating, and it may or may not make a difference on that piston at this point, because what I'll need to do is I'll need to measure the clearance between the piston and the cylinder bore, and if it's within specifications, I can reuse them. If it's not, then I'll need to replace the pistons. And it's like that on all the pistons. If you look at that one that's already sitting there, and I'm about to put that one next to you, you can see the same thing. It's got that same wear to it, where the phenolic coating just kind of wore off. Now I'm looking at the main cap. I see there's no numbers on them, so when I take the mains off, I have to keep them in order, because again, I have to stamp them to keep them in order, or keep them in order another way. What you don't want to do is you don't want to play musical chairs with any of your caps, your mains or your rod caps, because they're machined perfectly round with where they're at, so you can't put main caps in different spots. So now I'm going to rotate the engine over to bring those other 2 up. Cylinders 3 and 4. And I'm going to go ahead and remove cylinder 3s. I'm doing now is I'm talking about how I never looked at the other one to see how the side of the piston was. I was just such a hurry to take it apart. I wasn't inspecting it at the time, so I just went back to look at it. I saw that it was the same as cylinder 2. So now I'm removing cylinder 3 piston. Just give it a little tap on the side. It'll come off. I'm not wheeling on it. I'm literally just tapping. Pushing it down. Now, what you're trying to do here is, while you push it down, is try not to get the threads to rub up against your crank, because what it will do, that polished surface, it'll make marks in it, and those marks aren't good for the engine. Now, the rest of the journals, with the exception of that one crank journal, are fine. There's nothing wrong with it. That one crank journal that has a line in it is probably okay too, because it's just a line. I don't feel anything in it. When I inspect the crank, which will be another video, I will take some emery cloth or maybe even some Scotch-Brite, and I'm going to try to see if I can rub that mark out and see if it will come out easy. Just get that embedded aluminum out of those pores, which is what's making that line. It's got to be embedded aluminum in the pores because I can't feel a line where it cut into it. So I'm going to see if I can polish it out. Now, for some reason, I threw the piston over there in the corner and I never put the cap on. But I'll figure it out when I go to take this other cap off. I will figure that. I'll figure that out in a second. Silly me, never put the cap back. Which I will. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the number 4 cap. I should have rotated the engine over a little more. Make my life easier by rotating the engine over just a hair more. This is when I realize I have 2 caps. So I go ahead and pop that cap back on. Keep everything where they belong. I'm leaving the rod bearings with the rods, even though I'm going to end up replacing them. The re-ring kit that I saw comes with rods and mains, piston rings, and a full gasket set. So I'm going to end up getting that to redo this engine. Unless I can find a whole kit reasonable that comes with pistons and all that stuff. If I need pistons, again, if I need pistons, if I don't need pistons, then why put pistons in it? I'll do rod bearings just because the kit comes with rod bearings. I don't need rod bearings. Rod bearings are brand new. They look like they're brand new. So if you could reuse them, you would. When the bearings look like these do, you would reuse these. There's hardly any wear off of them. They look like they're just been slightly rubbed, just slightly polished on the end of what's called the babbitt material, the material that's embedded on the bearing itself. Okay, so the only 2 pistons left in the engine now are 5 and 6. Talking about the ring there, that's the crank sensor ring that's in there. Those grooves that are cut in it are what cause the crank sensor to send a signal to the ignition control module for that 7x signal. Removing those 2 rod caps, bolts. I'll try popping it off by hand every time, even though it never works. Give it a little tap. Once it pops free, it comes off easy. Using that socket extension to help guide the piston down and out. Now that I'm at the back of the motor, I'm looking at the bearings again and surprised at how clean they are. Again, for a motor with 170,000 miles, it just amazes me as to how clean these bearings are. Almost look like an engine that just maybe going 500 miles and took it apart. It's that clean. Really very surprised. Moving the last rod cap, cylinder 6. I should have done a better inspection on cylinder 5. That's the one that was losing compression, or at least leaking air past the rings. Excuse me. So that's the cylinder I'm going to want to look closer at. As to why it's leaking past the rings, is the rings worn out, that kind of stuff. And what I'll do is when I measure the pistons, I'm going to have to remove the rings to measure the piston to bore clearance, because that's the way I do that. I'm not going to bother measuring the pistons and measuring the bore and doing the math to be off by the tolerances of the tools that I use for measuring those. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a feeler gauge to check the fitness of the actual piston to the bore. And if it's larger, if 2000s is too loose, then obviously it's not good, because the spec is just under 3000s, but I like my pistons to fit at 2, just because that always seems to work best, makes the engine last longer. So I will use a 2 3000s feeler gauge. If 3000s is tight and 2000s is loose, then I am within spec. But if it's loose at 3, then I will then measure the bore to see if it's good. And then I'll see what the size is and compare that to my normal specifications before I order pistons, because I want to make sure that no block work needs to be done. Because at this point, if any block work needs to be done, any major block work that needs to be done, anything more than a light hone, I'm not interested in getting into too much crazy block work. Now I'm removing the caps, so I make some space there at the edge of the bench, and I'm just going to put the caps in line the way they came. I'm looking at it again. I'm looking at the bearing again. I'm looking at that small pile of aluminum in the oil hole there. That's the oil hole that fills that bearing. So now what I'm interested in seeing is if it's pure aluminum, or if it's got any steel in it, or is it steel, or what is it? It looks like a soft metal. I can tell by looking at it. It looks like aluminum to me. So I'm using a magnet and trying to pick it up with the magnet. And now I'm looking at it, and it looks like it's sticking to the magnet. It's the oil that's sticking to the magnet. So now I'm getting close to it with my finger with the metal, and one little piece of that went to it. So there is a piece of metal or ferrous metal in there, but most of it is aluminum. So I mean, it could be a couple of things. It could be one little piece of steel metal going in there and gouged it up until aluminum built up from the bearing cap itself, the babbitt material itself, and that's what I'm seeing built up in there. But to me, it just looks like shiny aluminum. It almost looks like aluminum chips. So I still need to find out where those aluminum chips came from, because I don't think it's bearing babbitt material. Most bearing babbitt material is very soft. It's a lead tin alloy type material where it's very, very soft. It's supposed to be soft. It's what's supposed to wear on the engine. And in the case of this, it's what may have saved my crank, because whatever got in there, it shaved away on the main bearing itself. And the crank itself doesn't look like it's really that much affected, except for some material being embedded on that line. So now I'm removing that rear cap. It's being a pain. And the reason why it's being a pain is because the rear main seal is there. And if you look, you can see there's some sealer, some silicone sealer at the edge of it to help seal it across the block. And so that's what was making it difficult. Now I'm looking at the rear main seal that wasn't leaking at all. It's going to obviously get a new one anyways. So now I'm gonna pick up the crank. I'm using the wrench to help pick it up, and I'm looking for a place to stand the crank up. When you store a crank and it's not in the block, what you should do is stand it up. If you lay it down, it could heat and contract in hot and warm or cold weather, and it could just kind of bend. So when you store a crank, you want to do it standing up, never laying down, but never to a point where it falls down. Now, I don't know what happened here, and I had seen it when the video was done, but I lost that the head camera, and now I can see what time it shut off. It was at this point. So I'll talk you through the rest. The video is almost over. It's only got a couple minutes left. Um, as I do a quick inspection of the parts in the empty block, and I'm looking at that. I'm looking at that the bearing, and there's a hole. There's a groove on the bottom of the bearing. The bearings that are in the block have a hole that feed. They actually feed the oil down to the crank there from the block, and then that's what feeds those holes, which sends the oil to the rods. And what that is there is it's got the chips in it that originated this problem. Again, as to what it actually is, I don't know yet. I still have to go through the block pieces and parts to see if I can figure out where and what it came from. Regardless of which, when it's going to get cleaned out, if I reuse the block, if it can be reused out. Looking at the groove that got cut into that one, it lines up perfectly with that groove that distributes the oil to that main. So it's just one of those things that I'm still not sure exactly what happened to cause it. And as long as everything comes out fine, I will reuse this engine. Again, I'm looking at the rest of the mains; they're fine. Put that main there, main bearing there. Now what I do is I do a quick look. I flip the engine over again, and I'm going to take a quick look. Now that the pistons are out, down those bores, and let's see, maybe we can see some of it, at least on those first three cylinders. Maybe we'll be able to see some of it when we shine the light down there. I'm going to use the light. I'm going to plug in the drop light that I have set off to the side there. And we're going to take a peek down the cylinders to see how bad they are. Again, I still have to do a thorough inspection. I just did a quick inspection here. Here's the drop light. I'm just going to move up to the side for half a second, plug it in. And now I'll come back. Now, I don't know why the head camera stopped working. I did hear the computer doing those, command beeps. Now you can see I brought the camera in to get a better view. It looks like I did a lousy job of doing that. Probably would have been better off if I just left it there. And I'm looking in the cylinder, and I'm looking for any scrapes up and down the side. I'm looking for any scratches, any gouges, any marks. And what I'm seeing preliminary here, you can see good there. What I'm seeing preliminary here there is that I can actually still see some of the original hole marks from when the engine was originally built, which means there's nowhere in that cylinder. I'm pointing at the hatches there, and you can see them in this one too. The original cross hatches, and it's amazing that you still see those at 170,000 miles. It's amazing the oil technology we have today. I wouldn't go saying it's going to be the metal technology, because that seems to almost be going in the backwards direction as to how cheaply they build stuff. But the metal technology is incredible. So I'm summarizing the video now, and I'm telling everybody thank you. I hope it went well. I don't know if anybody's watching or if anybody did watch. I will go over to the computer in a minute, and I will look to see if anybody's making any comments or made any comments during the video, and nobody did. and I can't blame them because if you clicked on the video, you had no idea what I was doing because I never put a description in it before I started. Again, this was the first time I did a live stream, so now I know that I should put a description in of what's going on. Um, Maybe I set some tags. Make sure the audio is working. Again, I thought this video did well as far as production goes. I do know several people, 15 to be exact, tried to watch it. I appreciate that. I will try to do better on my next live video, which will be coming up, where I'm going to go ahead and do a better inspection on the block. I'm going to go ahead and measure to see the piston to bore clearance. I'm going to go ahead and measure to make sure the deck isn't warped. I'm going to go ahead and make sure the mains aren't warped. I'm going to maybe measure the bores if I have to order new pistons. If my pistons are within clearance, the only thing I'm going to measure is taper not around. I'm not going to bother measuring a bore that I know I'm going to be able to use if it works well with the pistons I already have. If it's not going to work well with the pistons that I already have, I will measure the bore to make sure that they're within spec, which I believe they will be because of the cross hatches. Really just going through the motions on that one. But that's really it. So basically, that's what I'm doing now. I'm looking for comments, look, see who's watching. It showed one person watching at the time when I did that. I appreciate whoever that was trying to watch. I appreciate anybody who tries to watch any of my videos. I hope to do more live streams. I hope to actually do them in the backyard. We'll see how that works out. Again, camera placement's going to be everything. Camera placement here wasn't great. I will try to do better. If anybody has any suggestions, please give them. I would appreciate it. That's really it. The video is going to end very soon. So thanks.